Hello, everyone. Welcome to Avaiya's Overcoming PTSD curriculum. I'm Ande Anderson. My partner, Ike Allen, and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of Avaiya University. Avaiya is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive materials. Thank you so much for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Veronique Mead, is here to talk with us today about 9 paradigm shifts that explain PTSD, complex PTSD, and chronic illness, and how you can heal. Veronique has spent the last 20 years pulling together the research explaining how adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, attachment trauma, and additional types of adversity affect risk for autoimmune and other chronic illnesses. She left a career as a family doctor and assistant professor to find more effective tools for understanding and working with chronic disease, and retrained as a body-oriented psychotherapist specializing in trauma. She has been testing, experimenting with, and refining her views through her own deep personal journey with chronic illness, and she shares the research on her blog called Chronic Illness Trauma Studies. Veronique was also a featured teacher on Avaiya University's Healing from Childhood Trauma event. So welcome back, Veronique.
Thanks, Ande. It's great to be back.
It's great to have you back. I so enjoyed our first conversation, and I'm so excited that we can talk about this again and relate trauma to this really huge topic of chronic illness and chronic pain and all these things that so many people deal with as a result of trauma. So let's dive into that. So where do you start when you say there are 9 things in common between PTSD, complex PTSD, and chronic illness?
You know, just to start off with the first 3 things, one is that the science is really starting to show that the origins may be similar for all these different things. In fact, there's an article in Nature in May 2020 by, his name's Michael Marshall, and the scientists are not aware about trauma, very common in the research, medical, traditional healthcare world. But what their research is starting to show that this guy's writing about in this article is that instead of there being specific genes and specific diagnoses, they're realizing that the DSM-5 now that's used for diagnosis is flawed, and that you really can't pinpoint people with specific diagnoses. If you have one diagnosis like anxiety, you generally have at least another, if not more than that, like depression. And they're finding that there are hundreds of genes for each of these conditions. And so what they're starting to come to from research from someone in 2012 in Chicago proposed that there may be actually a single factor, a single cause that's at the origin for all these mental health conditions. And so as the first one for 9, the 9 of these pieces, it's really looking from the research I've been looking at for 20 years that trauma and adverse life experiences and things that elicit a threat response in our systems, even infections, are a very common cause for all of these things, whether it's PTSD or complex PTSD, which is more defined because it's a long-term exposure in childhood rather than single events. And also for chronic illness, that's been the biggest thing that blew me away when I started looking to see if trauma might be a risk factor for chronic illness. And then I started finding it all over the place, and I'd never heard about it as a physician.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, number 1 is that there may be actually a similar cause for all these health conditions, and that they're all a symptom of the same thing.
Interesting. Yeah.
I know. It's such it's a huge paradigm shift. And in this article in Nature, there's no comment of trauma, again, because there's really not a lot of awareness yet. But it takes time for the research to translate into clinical care. And so that's the first one.
Yeah.
And the second is this concept of genetics, as this article talks about too. But even as a physician, when I was being trained, my sense was, I didn't even think about it. Medical chronic illnesses, it's a genetic issue. And the problem with that is you can't do much about your genes. And so what I started learning from all the trauma research is, and what the researchers are starting to find, is that even if we do have a genetic predisposition for a particular condition, chronic illness, chronic mental health condition, it actually needs interaction with the environment in order to either turn on or to influence how early the symptoms might start or how late or how severe they might be. And that all comes to epigenetics, the way that environmental factors and other things influence our genes by attaching molecules to them and turning them on or off, or in some version, some degree of on or off.
Got it. So someone could experience a trauma or something in their life, potentially have PTSD, and that could affect how something genetic like manifests for them?
Yes, exactly. And so it could be that it stays dormant for their whole life. And they're seeing this in antibody studies where most of us in the general population have at least have one antibody for type 1 diabetes, the autoimmune version of diabetes. And we don't get the disease. And even those who are at risk, they tend to have more antibodies that accumulate over time, and eventually it shows up as type 1 diabetes. But those antibodies can actually come and go. And so you can have antibodies and they can actually reverse. And so I suspect that that's also all epigenetics and what's going on in your environment.
Gotcha.
And so the third, what's that?
I said there was number 2, yes.
There was number 2. Number 3 is, I think this is something that's still really common mistake in a way, a common error in medical care and healthcare in general, is this thought that if trauma is the cause or the risk factor, it means it's in your head or that it's psychological. Mm-hmm. And the science is really showing that that's not the case. Adverse experiences influence our genes through epigenetics, and they actually affect our physiology and our hormones. And so even mental health conditions, which were like PTSD in particular, which is the thing that started to get us to wake up a little bit about what trauma is something that's going on in the nervous system and in the hormones, and it's a physiological, biological process that's happening.
Gotcha. So like, you mentioned, right, it's not just, or if it's not psychological specifically, like what causes, is it biology that causes symptoms that people experience as a result of PTSD, or like how do you kind of, make sense of that?
There's exciting research coming out showing that it is in the biology, and that it's a survival response. They get stuck in the on position. So we get stuck in fight or flight mode, or we get stuck in freeze, or something in between. So that sense of hypervigilance or anxiety can be on the fight flight end of the spectrum. And things like chronic fatigue, which is the chronic illness that I've had for 20 years, that I've been climbing out of using all these principles that we're learning about trauma. Fatigue, brain fog, numbness, emotional numbness, those are all on the freeze end of the continuum. And Dr. Robert Navio at UC San Diego has done research in metabolics. And what he's come up with is a theory called the cell danger response. And so we're starting to get science happening at all these different levels of the body and in the physiology. And so this sense that it's a survival response is really starting to show up in a lot of places. And there's a great article, people can look it up in Discover magazine, called, it's Grandma's Experience Leaves a Mark on Your Genes. It's a great description, really easy to digest, about a discovery these researchers did at McGill University with rat pups. When they're not nurtured, or when they're raised by a less nurturing dam, they end up with a higher sensitivity to stress. In their cortisol receptors are different, and these are epigenetic changes that last a lifetime and into next generations. Mm-hmm. And that article talks about that. So that's actually number 4, is that it's not psychological, it's a physiological threat response or survival response.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, it made me think of, I hear more and more about that in reading. And it sounds like you're a big reader and writer because you have all these, all this data. Like it reminds me of like my grandma always telling this story of during the Depression, which was, she was in her, I don't know, 20s or 30s or something in the Depression. And how right at Christmas time they got a tangerine and some new pantyhose, and that was like the whole of their right Christmas stocking. Like this is what you got, and I guess I was just thinking about right the trauma that must have been experienced during those times of really like having a tangerine is like that's sustenance. That's like huge for people who also may not even have enough food. So I get right like those experiences affect all the generations, and it's mind-boggling that even happens.
And the tangerine could actually be a big gift in that kind of an environment. But what I found in my own family system that's come down the line as part of that too is a sense of less support for the family, for the children, for the systems, especially emotional support. And that's where we start to think about complex PTSD. In a way, there's like a form of emotional neglect that can happen in environments like the Depression, the pandemic, where if there's enough stress going on for the parents that they can't regulate, then it comes down the pike to the children or the next generations too. And so these are things that we've really underestimated.
Yeah.
That have a big impact. And so the fight flight response is number 4. Number 5 is, I learned this from a neurologist, Dr. Robert Scare, who got turned onto the whole concept of trauma well into his career. And he started to say, it's a nervous system issue, not a tissue issue. Mm. And so we tend to think if it's PTSD or complex PTSD, that means it's mental illness and psychologically related. If it's a chronic illness, it must be biological, and it must be a specific different cause for every different illness. But if you take that step back and you think about it as a nervous system issue, you start to see there too how trauma is influencing the HPA axis, the stress response, the cortisol response, but then it influences every tissue as well. So I thought of that as number 5. And number 6 came from the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences research. And when Oprah learned about ACEs, she really started talking about the concept that it's not asking what's wrong with you. It's about what happened to you.
Right.
And she was kind of really blown away by that concept. And now there's something emerging about what's right with you. So there's an evolving process as we start to, in more and more communities, start to learn and understand what trauma really is. So I think about number 6 and Oprah as that it's not your fault. And people still get that in all kinds of healthcare situations and by family members and friends and colleagues, thinking that if they've got symptoms or they're having trouble with something or that they're weak or that it's something that they've done or not done.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Like one of like the pieces of language I hear a lot is like, I'm broken, or I've had, something has happened and I'm just broken. And I'm like, gosh, it's like, right. Like we've all had traumas, and some way more significant than others, but yeah, it's something that happened in our bodies, right? Like that's what's so fascinating about what you're talking about, right? Our bodies react in certain ways for our survival. And if it's stuck in the way for survival, then yeah, it's no wonder we have these symptoms or are going through what we're going through or have struggle in relationships or, all that kind of stuff. It's fascinating. So I love that. Like what's right with you, right? Like that's so beautiful.
Exactly. And from that place, you can even start to think of symptoms as intelligent responses to something that was too much or that was overwhelming, which is ultimately a brief definition of trauma, is something that was overwhelming and that we could not overcome. So we had some event that led us to freeze because we couldn't escape using fight flight. And so there was some degree of helplessness or hopelessness. And so, yeah, there's really a beautiful evolution happening. And again, the science is starting to show us that these are intelligent responses and that they can show us the pathway home. And it sounds like a lot of the others who are speaking here are talking about very specific tools that people can use to get better, because we're working from that nervous system perspective, or the health of the system and the mind body and how everything's actually joined and connected, and wants to heal and is designed to heal.
Yeah, that's really beautiful thinking of it that way, right? The symptoms are these really God, I don't know, stepping stones or crumbs, right? Leading us to,
Yeah.
right, the path to healing, and right, like, yeah, when I think of it as like the body, like giving you a sign of something's going on and needs to be addressed, I think that's just kind of a beautiful way to, like, I guess, reconnect with the body and its intelligence and what it's trying to tell you.
One of my faculty, when I left medicine and retrained as a somatic psychotherapist at Naropa, Christine Caldwell, talked about these as breadcrumbs. They are breadcrumbs that offer you clues that can help you find your way. And in a culture like we have here in the US or in North America, and we're in such a hurry, and there's so much demand and need to keep showing up, and there's such a almost negative connotation about the idea of slowing down. And so that's what sometimes our symptoms actually force us to do when we haven't been able to listen to all the prior warnings when they were milder. They sometimes seem to have to get really loud to get us to pay attention and start listening, or learn how to listen, because that's not something that we really are taught.
No, it's like get on to the next thing and the next thing and keep moving and being active. Go, go, go. Yeah, that is
Be
definitely
productive.
right. And it,
Exactly.
like, speed up your healing. Let's get this thing going, right?
Fix it now. And that's part of the challenge about working with trauma, is that for most of us, it's not a quick fix. There is no quick fix, but there is a process. And the more we understand about how all this works, the more we can have that patience for ourselves and that self-compassion to really give it the time and the space that it needs.
Beautiful. So where are we? On number 5, 6, 5? I can't
So
remember now.
Oprah, Not Your Fault is number 6.
Okay.
And yeah.
So we're on 7.
So number 7 is really about how can we think about everything like this, mental health conditions and chronic illnesses having similar origins. And I think of number 7 as trauma, the trauma science being its own new paradigm. We are learning so much from trauma, even though it can be a dirty word in certain circumstances and certain settings. What we're learning is that even PTSD, for example, is not what we thought. We still, like, I was just Googling it before coming on, and it's still written as a single event thing. And actually, when you start to look at it, the research in PTSD, Rachel Yehuda, Mount Sinai, she's one of the most well-known researchers in PTSD and in multi-generational trauma and its effects, like the Holocaust effects. What she's been finding is that for example, the soldiers, the veterans who develop PTSD are also the ones who had more traumatic events and adversity in childhood.
Yeah.
It doesn't pop out of the blue. The event that triggers the PTSD tends to be the last event in a series of events. And what's striking is that this is what I've seen in the research in chronic illness also. And when you think about in Robert Navio's metabolic research at UC San Diego, what he did, he sent out a questionnaire in a small study he did with folks with chronic fatigue. And what it boiled down to of what happened in the year before their symptoms started was there were 5 categories of triggering events. And so there may be, I don't know what the number is for all different illnesses, but infection's a really common trigger for the onset of all kinds of different chronic illnesses. And it's all kinds of different infections. And so infection was one of the 5 things he found that often seem to have triggered the onset. Toxins, like mold, chemicals, like poisons. But then there were also things, psychological and physical trauma were also there. And I've done a survey, an informal survey on my blog for folks with chronic fatigue. And what I'm finding is for people who had infection as a trigger, a large amount of them have also had all these other things going on in the same year or two before the onset of a chronic illness. So that is part of number 7, is this sense that it's not a single event. It's usually an accumulation and dose, how often, how much, how severe, and usually it's something that started early in life.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I've started doing is I'm using the ACEs research, which is really making inroads all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
There are hundreds of studies now and a couple systematic analyses that have been done. And so it's really starting to pave the way for an understanding of trauma. And what I'm doing is I'm building on the term of ACEs and looking at other types of trauma. So adverse babyhood experiences, for example, is another term I've come up with for events that happen before a child's 3rd birthday. Pre and perinatal events, a difficult birth, even C-sections. There have been 2 new research studies that just came out, or they came out in 2020 for 40 years after C-sections. One of them looked at the entire population in Denmark. And what they found is that there's increased numbers of autoimmune diseases in folks who are born by C-section.
Mm.
And the other study was done in women, in nurses study, and there's a high risk of type 2 diabetes. And so we tend to think maybe it's the gut flora, maybe it's the microbiome, maybe it's because there's not as much clearing out of the lungs if it's not a vaginal delivery. But I think a big piece that's missing, and why I coined the term for ABEs, adverse babyhood events, is that a lot of these things are traumatic. And that has an actually huge impact on a parent, especially moms. That's where most of the research has been done, but on a mother's ability to bond with her baby.
Mm.
If she has an emergency C-section because of life-threatening something or other, that's normal to freak out because of that. The staff is sped up. You lose the connection with people who are there to support you. But other kinds of events too. So if a baby was in an incubator, needed intensive care, if the mom or the baby had to be hospitalized after going home, things that separate mom and baby in particular can affect bonding. And that in turn influences how our nervous systems and our immune systems develop and are shaped. Mm-hmm. And another term, and it's in one of the books that I have as a free download, are ACRES, Adverse Childhood Relationship Experiences. And that's really what we think of for complex PTSD. It's the relationship people have with their parents or their adult caregivers growing up. And the research is showing, there's a new study out, 2019, by Ali Crandall in Utah, finding that having fewer positive events or experiences as a child may actually be more impactful on our risk for health conditions than abuse and adversity. Mm. And so I think of ACRES, complex trauma, developmental wounds, as probably the most underestimated risk factor of all of them for all of these conditions: mental health conditions, physical conditions, chronic conditions. And adverse babyhood experiences are a risk factor because of how they can interfere with bonding. They're also a risk factor for ACEs. So we start to look at the trauma science in groups, in categories like this. And what I've been pulling together is the research from these different bodies of knowledge, and they all just keep pointing in the same direction.
So the study with the parents, so I'm understanding this correctly. If if they have less positive experiences in their life, in their childhood, that could make them more susceptible to chronic illness. So let's say someone had 90% of their childhood was positive and they had a few traumatic events. Maybe they were abused. Maybe they had, I don't know, some bad thing happened to them, but the 90% of their childhood was positive. Is that like, that would indicate, since they had more positive experiences, they may be less likely to have a chronic illness based on that? Is that right?
Yes, or and it's not just chronic illness, it's any of these effects of trauma.
Okay.
You know, whether it's PTSD or complex PTSD where it's difficult, intimacy is difficult, or relationships with intimate partners or friends or coworkers, or a chronic illness. And what those positive experiences do, things like having good friends and neighbors, things like having a belief that there is comfort and it's possible to be comforted, having parents who repair when they make the totally human mistakes we all do. Mm-hmm. They actually support resilience. And so it could be that if you've had a lot of that support and resilience and you have an accident, that you are able, your system is able to rebound and recover as it's designed to much more easily.
Got it.
Yeah, and if you've grown up with abuse, that makes the caregiver a much less reliable, it's the source of threat. And so again, if that's something that's gone on over a long period of time, you're likely going to not have as many positive experiences in that system because of the parents' difficulty with regulating themselves and their own trauma that makes them abusive. So the positive experiences are more protective than we realized.
That is such great news. I love that.
I know. Yeah.
Really powerful to get. So, I mean, and obviously I know that there are a lot of people watching right now that did not have many positive experiences growing up or have had really rough times. So, but I guess the question would be, right, like, even if you haven't had a lot of positive experiences, if moving forward in your healing journey, you start, cultivating more positive experiences and healthy relationships, can those also be powerful as you're moving forward in resiliency?
Exactly. And that is part of the beauty of this understanding that we're getting about the role of life experiences and the human experiences. We all are going to experience some degree of stress and difficulty and challenge or trauma. And so, and that's actually another one of these. So we talked about number 7. Number 8, we could talk about being brain plasticity and epigenetics. There is way more reversibility than we've realized in all of these chronic conditions because they are a system. And these are still theories. They're not widely accepted yet by any means, but the research that I keep seeing supports this sense that we have symptoms because our bodies are caught in fight, flight, freeze. And so our brains went into that direction really kind of as a best friend to protect us at all costs, but then weren't able to get out of that state and got stuck in it. And so we can get unstuck. And all these different approaches can chip away at the system and provide, even decades after the events, even after we've developed symptoms, they can start to provide a reminder of that sense of safety that helps the nervous system start to switch off that signaling.
Yeah, safety. You give me the chills just thinking about it. That is such a big one for me. And I know in talking to so many people in our community how safety is just, that seems to be the missing piece in so many people's lives, recovery, not feeling that safety. And once you can have that experience, it's like, oh, it's such an amazing experience that can, bring you through so much. So awesome. What are we at? 9, 10?
100?
Yeah, we're it's a long list of paradigm shifts here.
Yeah, they are. The safety piece, it doesn't have to be a big thing. And this is one of my favorite things I learned in my training in somatic experiencing. So for example, if you allow your system to orient to something that appeals to you, to pay attention to, like, I put these plants because I really like them, and they're really supportive, and I especially like this color green.
Mm-hmm.
If you let yourself take in, whether it's the color or the sense of the beauty of something, and let yourself actually notice, not just like out here with your eyes, but what happens if you take it in just a little bit, something that appeals to you, and you just notice, like for me, my system, like in my gut, something just dropped down a little bit and settled just a little bit thinking about this plant.
Mm-hmm.
That is all it takes to convey even an iota of safety to your system.
Mm.
It's something that's happening in the present moment. It's something that appeals and draws your attention. And so it's providing different information to your system than what our patterns in these survival responses are doing. So it's actually working that brain plasticity pathway and helping it shift ever so slightly in this other direction.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that in the world of, something that can be a simple shift. Yeah. And I know somatic experiencing quite well from working with several people that have been, trained in that. And that is a very, that technique is just killer. I love that. Awesome. So after safety becomes
Number 9.
number 9.
Number nine is kind of, how can you tell if your symptoms were caused by trauma, or if it's even related to trauma, so that you can tell, are any of the things that might work for trauma, might they help with your symptoms? And I think of it as kind of like the leopard's spots. When you see spots on a big cat, you know it's a leopard and not a lion. There's another phrase from Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who's the founder of Body Mind Centering, and hers is, the mind is like the wind and the body is like the sand. If you want to see how the wind is blowing, you look at the sand. And in medicine, we tend to think that the ripples in the sand, that there's some cause right there. But what we're learning from trauma is that those are evidence of what's happened, what kind of wind was blowing, or whether the waves were coming in. And so what I'm really starting to think after 20 years of the research is that if you have chronic symptoms, the chances are that there's some link to trauma in your past. Just like if you see spots on a leopard, it's a leopard and not a lion. And so it's this sense that I think most symptoms, most chronic conditions are linked to trauma. And it comes back to that article in Nature in May 2020 of, there may actually be, from everything they're seeing with genetics and in their research, maybe there's actually a single risk factor or single cause, which is kind of mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. So like, as far as symptoms go, this is something we could look at to see if chronic symptoms that people are experiencing have come from trauma. Like, I guess, like, what does this mean for treatment? And, this whole event is about, right, really overcoming PTSD and overcoming PTSD symptoms. So do you think that prevention of those symptoms is possible, or can you reverse any of these symptoms?
They are reversible. I mean, that's the thing. The challenge can be that if it's decades after a lifetime of difficult experiences and neglect or abuse in childhood and few positive experiences and more things that have added on, it tends to take longer than we may want or realize or recognize. But the fact that these are reversible is huge. And this is Navio's proposal with the cell danger response, is that it's a healing cycle that got stuck. So all these different tools, whether it's mind-body practices or slowing down and coming into the present moment, mindfulness practices, these are all actually working to send different information from the present to help the nervous system shift out of where it's caught from the past, really. Mm-hmm. And so when we think of symptoms, you know, if you grew up in a household where it was safer if you were quiet, or if you kind of took care of the adults in the system, or you were a people pleaser, a lot of us with chronic illness are people pleasers, even in subtle family systems with no abuse, these are patterns that are built on a survival response. And so working with those, cognitive therapy is not something that's traditionally thought of as a way to work with trauma. Or maybe I should take that back. It's still the most studied and most cited research, cognitive behavioral therapy. And so people think it's a good one for trauma. What it may be really good at is helping us recognize that we have beliefs that may not actually be true or accurate, and work with those. But what I think are really helpful are the trauma therapies that are based in the somatics, because trauma is not in our conscious awareness, it's in our bodies and nervous systems, and we access it through things like sensation or imagery. And so I think it's really what appeals to you. Where do you start? Where do you want to start? Is it with a mind-body practice? Is it with changing your diet? Because that actually decreases a lot of threat responses or inflammation, and it creates more room for the system to begin to heal. And so for some people, it's trying these different pieces, and for others, it's going straight for trauma therapy. And I'd say if you've got a chronic illness and you're open to it, do as many of these as you can, because they all chip away at different parts of the paradigm of the pathways that are happening.
Got it. Thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned diet in there too, because I think we may have talked about that a little bit last time. And I was wondering that as you were talking, right? Because, right, where does that come into play? Lifestyle choices, exercise, diet, those kinds of things, based on having trauma, you know, stuck in us, so to speak, and how does that influence things? So okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, there are, when you go online and you look, you find people who have recovered from chronic illnesses of all kinds doing so many different things. And I think that also speaks to this model about how many different ways there are to heal. And PTSD can be a real challenge, a real bear to overcome as well. And so, again, even for a mental health condition, diet could make a huge difference. If it can calm down inflammation, that can right off the bat help our systems settle. And then that gives us more room to either try more things or settle a little more easily or sleep a little bit better. And then just as trauma adds up in its effects, all the things that we do add up in their counter effects also. And you know, you mentioned prevention. I think one of the pieces that's really helpful here in understanding trauma is parents who work on their own trauma and their own healing for themselves. It actually also helps their kids and can have these multi-generational benefits that go down the line. And so I think the way I've come to think about it at this point is almost, if you understand trauma, then there's a lot of things you know, or a lot of things you can try because you have a big picture, a big context. And so I'm kind of a big proponent for understanding trauma in the realm where we don't know much about it, or we've got a lot of blame associated with it. How do we catch up with what the science is actually telling us?
Beautiful. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, I love that. Thank you. This has just been such an awesome conversation. So I feel like we could go on and on and on.
I know.
in the interest of time, will you let us know what the 10th paradigm shift is?
There were only 9.
Oh my God, you're right. See,
I'm sure there's 10, but
that's awesome.
We could probably, we could add all kinds of these to the 10th one, like the fact that adding things up, adding all these positive benefits.
There is the 10th paradigm shift. There it is.
There it is.
Okay, I still wanted there to be more. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so I'd love it if you could share with everyone a couple things. I know that you have a couple of offers, gifts for people, and you have such great content on your blog and so many amazing resources for people. So everybody, there's a couple buttons below this video that link over to Veronique's site. So could you share what those two things are?
So one of them is a blog post I wrote, and you can download it in a book PDF format, about adverse childhood relationship experiences, or really the foundation of complex PTSD. And I think of them as invisible ACEs because I think they're the most underestimated risk factor for all kinds of chronic conditions. So that's one of the downloads. And I cite one of the questions in it. You know, people often ask, how do we know about resilience? How do we know if we have our own resilience factors? And there's one person out there who has a particular question that they asked in their medical practice over the years that they found was the most helpful question to get a sense of whether or not you've experienced acres, whether that was something you have a resilience factor or not. And then the other one is the 6 books that I would say are the go-to books to really keep getting that picture about all the different kinds of traumas. I have these books, 5 of them are on the five different kinds of traumas, and they'll give you a picture of things like ABES or multi-generational trauma. And there's also one, and I have a book, a friend and colleague just wrote this book on complex PTSD, and it's filled with exercises for really chipping away and working on acres on complex PTSD. And so some of these books offer exercises as well. And so these are the ones I think of that can keep expanding your horizons. If you need more tools, they keep giving you more ideas on how to keep chipping away at this.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, everyone, there are 2 buttons below that lead over to both of those from Veronique. So thanks for offering that for everybody. Are there any last insights? Anything else you feel like we've left out? We've covered a lot of things, not 10, but 9. And are there anything else you want to share with people before we wrap up?
You know, I think the bottom line, Andy, is that there is just hope, so much hope from this paradigm shift that's happening and what the science is beginning to really tell us, and that people know when something's wrong and they have things that appeal to them and that pull on them. And I just want to say, you go for it. Keep following those things that are calling to you, even if your healthcare providers don't all get it. There's a lot of hope out here.
Love that. Thank you. It's been so awesome to reconnect with you, Veronique. Thank you so much for being here.
Same here. Thanks so much, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for showing up for yourself and being willing to go on this journey and really heal and love yourself. So we'll see you again real soon. Take care.